Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is my bookish channel where I talk about all my favourite books and stuff. I'm Paul, and I've reached a certain point on my rainbow shelves discussions as I zigzag about my bookshelves, and it's my orange day. Now, for us readers of a certain generation and a certain persuasion, orange and paperbacks mean one thing. They mean Penguin classics. Penguin kind of um, contemporary classics, I guess, in the 1980s. And I could do a whole video about my favourite penguins, but I'm not going to. From my shelf, as examples, I've picked up Howard's End, which in which a whole bookcase falls on Leonard Bast, and I think kills him or knocks him sick. Anyway, we don't want that to happen. Although I do have a habit of knocking over books in these videos, piles of books. This is my copy of Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, which I had as a 16-year-old and read again and again and again and wrote an essay about when I was about 17. I think it was the first kind of properly homoerotic novel that I read, and I couldn't believe it. D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow, Orange Spine, also read at 16 and obsessed over doing my A-levels. Look at the notes, they're in fountain pen and so tiny all the way through. Right, so that's the penguins done in one swoop. There's loads of them all over the house because, of course, you ended up collecting all of them. But I want to talk about other orange books from my shelves. Here's Beryl Bainbridge's paintings. Look at her in the back being pushed along in a pushchair by her grandchildren. Beryl Bainbridge was a wonderful British novelist who also painted, and she was known as a novelist for 40, 50 years before she died, and was doing these paintings the whole time. People kind of knew about them. She had exhibitions in London and stuff, and her house in Camden was full of her paintings, these huge canvases with kind of historical figures. They were murky and dark. Here's Napoleon dancing. They were lovely pictures. And this book is Thames and Hudson, so it's a proper art book by Psyche Hughes, and I think, from what I remember, that was her best mate. And lots of this monograph, which should be about, it is about paintings, but a lot of it's gossip about what Psyche and Beryl did on their holidays. As far as I remember, I got this from the library, and then I had to go looking for my own copy because I loved it so much. It was all about getting caravans and hooking up with fellas and all the kind of boozy, sexy times they seemed to have in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Very funny, very Beryl, and a really good read. And it's lovely seeing the pictures produced so beautifully in a Thames and Hudson book. It's a bit like reading about Hockney, those kinds of books, because it's the similar decades and a similar kind of racy life, really. Um, Beryl Bainbridge, when I was a very young novelist starting out in the mid 90s, was very nice to me. She hooted with laughter in the audience at a fancy reading in King's Lynn in 1996. I was reading as part of a British Council presentation from New Writing 6, I think it was. And there's me on the platform with Louis de Bernier, who was also reading, and Dr. Harriet Harvey Wood, who was in charge and quite proper and quite firm, um, made me read the whole of my story that was in that volume. And she was being naughty as well, because she knew the second half of my story was very sexy and rude indeed, and I was only going to read the first half. Anyway, they ganged up on me and made me read the whole lot to the Blue Rinse set of King's Lynn, this very nice audience of quite well-to-do people in the town hall at King's Lynn. And so I read this, all this gay, sexy stuff. in this room that was robin egg blue with gilded chairs. It was a very funny festival full of all kinds of personalities and adventures. And I'll tell the whole story someday, but it was one of those do's. And Beryl sat in the audience and giggled like mad at all the rude bits, like a schoolgirl. And we got on from that moment on. I'd never met her before. She thought it was hilarious. She took me out to tea in King's Lynn, and I've got the handwritten receipt of everything we consumed as she gave me all this advice about being a novelist. And it begins with pot of tea for two, cake, biscuits, coffee for two, more cake, biscuits, bottle of whiskey, bottle of wine, and it goes down. And it was quite a long afternoon. And she said her advice, I think she told me this later, and I went to see her in Camden, and we had tea in her house with all these paintings around. And she was just finishing her book about the Titanic, Every Man for himself. And she said she'd hallucinated. She'd been up all night finishing the end of it, and a courier was coming to take the manuscript away. This is before email. It was 96, at least before she used email. And she'd hallucinated coming down the stairs that she was on the Titanic and sinking, and she could taste salt water. So she knew she'd stayed up too late writing this thing. Anyway, so she still made tea the next day for me, and I went round. And she said, two bits of advice to a young novelist. Don't fall in love before you're 30, and don't drink while you're writing. And they always stuck in my head as very good advice. Anyway, that's Beryl's Thames and Hudson art book. Somewhere down there, I've got the biography that came out after this, the big, huge biography. Yeah, by Brendan King, which I've partly read. I haven't launched into properly. Lunch Poems, Frank O'Hara. This is poem. This is a very famous poem. I love Frank O'Hara. He was a New York poet in the 50s, 60s, and he would go to this is the legend, I don't know if I've remembered it correctly, on his lunchtime from MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, where he was a curator, he would go to a department store where they had fancy typewriters, and he would, on the hoof, on a display copy, type out a poem straight from his head at lunchtime every day. And that's where this whole collection comes from. I love that legend. It might not be true. I hope it is. And I've just found somebody's email address and phone number slipped inside. A writer. I mean, a writer's email slipped inside a book. Anyway, poem. Lana Turner has collapsed. I was trotting along, and suddenly it started raining and snowing, and you said it was hailing, but hailing hits you on the head hard. So it was really snowing hard and raining, and I was in such a hurry to meet you, but the traffic was acting exactly like the sky, and suddenly I see a headline, Lana Turner has collapsed. There is no snow in Hollywood. There is no rain in California. I have been to lots of parties and acted perfectly disgraceful, and I have never actually collapsed. Oh, Lana Turner, we love you. Get up. It's kind of pure camp in a poem, 1962. And I just realized There Is No Rain in California is from a song, isn't it? Is it Nielsen? And I wonder if that's what ends up in Midnight Cowboy, which is of a piece, I suppose, of the same time, a bit later than this. Yeah, I love his ramshackle, juicy and colourful poetry. That's what I love about Frank O'Hara. And the kind of, it can go anywhere. All the kind of references to all kinds of things, to arty things, to life, to slightly saucy things, makes me laugh. Another orange book I read in 1993, the Susan Sontag Reader. It's so dense with all these excerpts from her perfectly serious books about all kinds of stuff, really deadly serious modernist artworks, contemporary for the time film and painting and thought. She was a philosopher, really. And the thing that leapt out to me and was most useful to me in the early 90s, when I remember staying with my nana in Jarrow and reading this in 93, it was her notes on camp and against interpretation, which for me were kind of a piece with the queer theory stuff that I was thinking about at the time, 30 years ago or more. And she never quite got her due, I don't think, at that time, or maybe even now, as somebody formative in that kind of thinking. Anyway, the camp stuff is brilliant. Note 10, for example. Camp sees everything in quotation marks. It's not a lamp, but a lamp. Not a woman, but a woman, in inverted commas. To perceive camp in objects and persons is to understand being as playing a role. It is the farthest extension in sensibility of the metaphor of life as theatre. 11. Camp is the triumph of the Epicene style, the convertibility of man and woman, person and thing, but all style that is artifice is ultimately epicene. Life is not stylish, neither is nature. I just loved her. And I loved her kind of looking out the window in a jumper like that, thinking, what am I going to turn my fearsome attention to next? She was great. Wayne Kostenbaum's book on Andy Warhol is mostly about movies, about the movies that Warhol made. Those, 24-hour long films of skyscrapers through the day, or people getting sucked off very slowly. and he makes a great case for Warhol's autism, I think, as being the kind of driving force for his concentration on very banal objects and repetition. Frank O'Hara comes up in this, I noticed when I was flicking through before. O'Hara, who was the insouciant, nervy poet and curator at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, which as early as 1958 had proclaimed its indifference to Warhol by refusing the donation of one of his shoe drawings. Warhol admired and envied members of the aesthetic gay intelligentsia, Rauschenberg, Johns, and O'Hara key among them, and he attempted to court O'Hara, although O'Hara disliked Warhol's work and only came round to an appreciation of it a year or so before his own untimely accidental death in '66. I think O'Hara was run over by a moon buggy at the beach, I think. According to O'Hara biographer Brad Gooch, Warhol sought the good graces of the smart, gay set. Quote, Warhol gave O'Hara an imaginary drawing of the poet's penis, which he crumpled up and threw away in annoyance. Recall that Garbo too had crumpled one of Andy's drawings. Warhol wanted to draw Frank O'Hara's feet. The poet declined the offer. They just sound such a silly bunch. Great fun. Now, Georgina Hammick. Here's an orange book. Vintage. Vintage in more ways than one. I keep finding notes in these things. It's amazing. This is from my friend Ruben. I think this is from 1999. Anyway, this book comes from slightly earlier, when I first knew Georgina Hammick, who is one of the most wonderful short story writers ever. And this is her collected stories from the mid-90s. And she signs it in 1996 in Berlin to me. So that was the first time I'd met her, I think. I'll tell the whole story of that. I've written about it somewhere. She died last year, Georgie. We were friends for half my life. And she was a great supporter and advocate for my stuff, really. Anyway, she wrote fantastic novels and short stories, and my favourite is one called Mad About the Boy, which is about Noel Coward. And in this story about an adolescent girl at school, and you know that it's uh, quite autobiographical. She has fantasies of running off to London and going to see Noel Coward at home. This is in the 1950s. And it takes on great clarity, this dream. Before falling asleep, she invented a dream about him. The dream was always the same. On a foggy afternoon, she would escape down the drive, pitted tarmac and enclosed by species rhododendrons and ponticums now glistening unpleasantly in the fog, and walk the 2 miles to the station and the London train. At Waterloo, she'd take a taxi to 17 Gerald Road, the studio flat he lived in when he wasn't in Jamaica or wherever. He came to the door himself, peered down, saw at a glance how fascinating she was under her cloak of shyness, and invited her in for tea. That whole line, how fascinating she was under her cloak of shyness, is such a novelly kind of phrase. It's such a girl's annual kind of phrase. And that's one of the things about Georgie's work. This is somebody who is steeped and marinated in books, and flags up that fascination, that obsession, to other readers. It's a bookish kind of wit. And invited her in for tea. Tea was crumpets in a silver dish, accompanied by light and witty conversation. She made him laugh a lot. After tea, he showed her his treasures and his books and pictures. These included 2 landscapes he'd painted himself, until they were interrupted by actor friends dropping in for cocktails. He was proprietorial about her, but introduced her to them with pride, as though he himself had invented her. Occasionally, he'd pat her head, which made her blush with pleasure. When his visitors were invited to stay for supper, she stayed too, and helped Cole. She knew about Cole from reading Present Indicative, serve it. They had cold roast mutton and baked potatoes and onion sauce and salad, followed by apple pie and cheese and biscuits. There was red wine to drink. Coffee was served in the drawing room. Noel, do stop calling me Mr. Coward, there's a darling, sat down at the grand piano and played a few bars. Antonia, he beckoned her with his finger, come and sing a duet with me. They sang You Were There from Shadow Play. She owned the record of this, and had sung Gertie's part so often, copying every idiosyncratic note, that she sounded just like her, she thought. Noel seemed to think so too. Eventually, the visitors began to drift away, fetching sable wraps, the women, and capes and white silk scarves, the men, from Noel's bedroom. When she said, I must go now, he said, not in this fog, dear, and in any case, you've missed the last train. So she stayed, dressed in a pair of his pyjamas. They were slub silk and striped in pink and grey. She slept, curled up beside him, in his huge double bed under a black satin quilt with scarlet roses on it. It's a fantastic fantasy. Um, and the details, the slub silk and the colours and the food make it real. You share her fantasy of being taken in under the wing of this amazing person. Um, I'm kind of running out of time. This is an orange book from 1991. Uh, it was a gift from a very early boyfriend of mine who was older than me. He had been my Shakespeare professor when I was 21, and after my finals, when we all ran down to the English department to see what the results were as they pinned them to the board, he was waiting there to see what I was. I think he knew what I'd got for my degree, because he would have been on the exam board. Thinking back, um, and I was nervous as hell. We'd been to the bar first, and I took 2 of my friends with me to kind of support me for going to see these results. Now, of course, it would all come by email. It wouldn't be the same excitement to be in the English department, to go up to the board. Anyway, I got a good degree, and Richard was there waiting, and very romantically, now that I was out of his care as a student, asked me out on a date. And it was something I'd never really experienced before, having only come out at 20. So I was wined and dined that summer in 1990, 91. And he brought on the first day this wonderful compendious book, the Faber Book of Gay Short Fiction, edited by Edmund White, with a Hockney picture of Peter, I forget his surname, but his muse of the early 70s, Hockney's muse of the early 70s, with his willy out on the front. And it's still got his postcard, his from the time, Pierre and Gilles, one of their pictures, about phoning me to go out. And when he dedicates the book at the front, he quotes Auden and says to Paul, one of the ruined boys who wins all the prizes. Thanks a lot. Anyway, it's a really good collection. Just realised there's Tom Wakefield in here, in between James Baldwin and Paul Bailey. And Tom Wakefield is somebody I've meant to read for years and years. Patrick Gale talked about him a lot. Published by Serpent's Tail and the Gay Men's Press. I need to look into his work because he was northern and gay, and a couple of decades or a decade before I started doing stuff. And for some reason, I've missed out on his books, probably because they're out of print. So it was an introduction to the pantheon of gay authors. I'm going to stop there. I've still got orange books on the pile there to go, but I'm already at 22 minutes by the looks of it. I gabble on too much, and I probably read too much from these books. Let me know below in the comments what you think. Am I reading from these too much? Am I bringing in too many anecdotes of my own? Let me know how you feel about this stuff. Anyway, I'm going to say goodbye, and press like, subscribe to my Patreon, where there'll be more of this stuff. And happy adventures and happy reading, and we'll talk again soon. Okay, goodbye.